It's the best history. It's art history. With Jordan and Callie.
First, we're going to talk about the Parthenon and Greek architecture. So the Parthenon was built from 447 to 438 BC, and it was made of marble and limestone.
Here we see the ruins of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece today. Here we can see an exact replica of the Parthenon, which stands in Nashville, Tennessee.
After the Persian Wars, Pericles asked the other Greek city-states to pool money into the Delian League to fund a second Persian War. But he ended up using all the funds from the Delian League to build a massive temple to his patron Athena.
The Parthenon was 228 feet long, 101 feet wide, and 65 feet high. It was built primarily in the Doric order, which was based off the Dorian sphere of appearing ostentatious before the gods. As a result, the columns lacked ornamentation and were a lot simpler than Ionic and Corinthian order columns. However, the frieze of the Parthenon was built in the Ionic order, which was based off the Ionians' gratitude towards the gods, so it was more ornate than the Doric order ones. The frieze is a continuous band of sculpture, rather than an alternating pattern of metopes and triglyphs, which is typical of Doric order friezes. The Ionic frieze allowed the Greeks to better display their stories. The Greeks valued symmetry in their architecture, but ironically didn't use any straight lines or right angles. The ground was curved up in the middle to fight the illusion that the temple was sagging, and all the columns were bowed out using entasis to account for optical illusions. Even the columns aren't the same. The ones on the end are thicker and have less space between them, since the Greeks knew they would look smaller due to the light coming in around them. The Parthenon was a peripteral temple, meaning it had freestanding columns surrounding the entire structure. The interior featured one cella, meaning room, which contained a gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos. Even though the Parthenon is thought of as a sacred space, in a sense, it's not actually a temple since none of the worship happened inside the actual Parthenon. In fact, only priests were allowed inside the temple, so the statue was more of a gold reserve than a cult statue since no one was actually allowed to see it.
On the east pediment, the carvings depicted the birth of Athena. The pediment depicts how she sprung out of Zeus's mind, and was thus named the goddess of intelligence, wisdom, war, and virginity. On the west pediment, the carvings depict the contest between Poseidon, who was the god of the sea, and Athena for patronship over Athens. The people of Athens chose Athena's olive tree over Poseidon's water fountain, which turned out to be salty and useless. Each frieze on the outside of the Parthenon was inspired by Greek victories over worthy opponents. The north frieze was inspired by the sack of Troy. The east frieze was inspired by the Gigantomachy, which was the war between the Olympian gods and the Titans. The south frieze was inspired by the Centauromachy, and the west frieze was inspired by the Amazonomachy, which was the war between the Greeks and the Amazons. Along the interior frieze, the Greeks depicted a Panathenaic procession, which was a procession in which the youth of the city accompanied a wheeled ship carrying a new robe for an ancient wooden statue of Athena. The exterior of the Parthenon was actually painted with bright colors. However, the remains of the Parthenon today, after the Ottoman-Venetian War, has lost all its color.
Now let's move on to the Temple of Minerva. Located in the city of Veii, just 18 kilometers north of Rome, the Temple of Minerva was built around 510 to 500 BC from wood, mud brick, and tufa, which is a type of volcanic rock. This temple was built by the Etruscans, ancient peoples who inhabited the entire Italian peninsula before the Romans dominated. The Etruscans were the first superpowers of the Western Mediterranean, who, along with the Greeks, developed the first true cities. Their remnants in the modern day are Florence, Siena, and Pisa. Little of their histories or literature have survived, but their influence can be seen throughout the Roman Empire as they taught them the alphabet and spread literacy throughout the Italian peninsula. Early on, the Etruscans had always preferred to use spaces and groves in nature, allowing for an open sky to worship. However, in 600 BC, the Etruscans became inspired by the Greeks and decided to change their way of creating places of worship. The Etruscans began building monumental structures for the gods, one of which was the Temple of Minerva. The temple was dedicated to the worship of Minerva, the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess Athena. The temple itself stands on a tufa block foundation, which is volcanic rock, and has proportions of 5:6, making the temple nearly square. The foundation was very high off the ground, so it allowed the temple to be elevated. The only stairs featured are between the center two columns and lead on the path to the central entrance. The temple is divided into two parts. The first part is a deep front porch with 2 rows of 4 Tuscan columns. Tuscan columns are very simple in nature and resemble the Doric order of the Greeks in that they are very plain and lack ornamentation, but they also follow the proportions of the Ionic order, meaning that they were longer and thinner than the Doric order ones. The interior of the temple was divided into 3 parts, known as the triple cella. This reflects the divine triad between Minerva, Tenea, the Roman equivalent of Zeus, and Uni, the Roman equivalent of Hera.
Noticeably different from other temples we have seen, the Temple of Minerva features sculptures on the roof of the building. One of the most well-preserved sculptures is the sculpture of Apollo, a life-size terracotta figure by the master sculptor Volca. This was believed to be a part of a scene depicted on the roof that reenacts a certain narrative. It's believed his counterpart in the scene was Hercules, and that the scene depicted an epic contest over the golden hind deer, sacred to Apollo's sister Artemis. Both were siblings of Athena.
Here we see the sculpture of Apollo, which was found on the roof of the temple. You'll notice that some of the paint still remains, and that's because a lot of Etruscan sculptures were made out of fired clay, whereas Greek sculptures were made out of marble, and so the fired clay was able to preserve color better than the marble.
Although the original temple is not standing today, Vitruvius, a Roman architect, wrote about the temple's design and features, so replicas and models of the temple are able to be constructed today.
Here we see a model made based off of Vitruvius' descriptions. We can note the square shape of the structure and its elevation off the ground. We also get a better idea of what the sculptures on the roof looked like. The Etruscans became known for this innovation. They created rooftop scenes, which created an impressive tableau against the backdrop of the sky.
So now we're going to talk about the Pantheon, which was recreated by Emperor Hadrian in 120 AD, and it's made entirely of concrete.
Here we have the Pantheon. The current Pantheon is actually a replica of the original building, which was destroyed by fire in 80 AD. It was recreated around 120 AD by Emperor Hadrian.
Hadrian was an emperor that was very passionate about architecture, so of course he took this monumental project on. At first, he worked with Apollodorus of Damascus, a prominent Greek architect, but because of arguments over the design, he ended up having Apollodorus executed. Here we see the modern-day Pantheon, standing in Rome, Italy.
The Pantheon is composed of 2 parts, the portico, or porch with Corinthian columns, and the rotunda. There's no sculptural frieze, but it does have an engraving that says Marcus Agrippa built this because he was the original builder of the Pantheon. Now we will take a closer look at the rotunda, a circular structure topped with a concrete dome. It is intended that a perfect sphere could sit inside to symbolize the vault of heaven. This circle was really perfect. It was exactly 142 by 142 feet.
There's a ridge on the rotunda that possibly marks the original spot for the roof to be built, though the actual roof is a bit lower, so I guess you could say they forgot to raise the roof!
The light coming from the oculus, or the hole in the center of the roof, moves around the building in sort of a reverse sundial effect and serves as a cooling and ventilation method. The oculus was an engineering gem of the Roman world. No oculus had even dared come close in size to the one in the Pantheon. It is still lined with the original Roman bronze and is the main source of light for the whole building. On the inside of the dome, there are recessed squares that lighten its ceiling.
Here we see the oculus today, with light streaming through it.
The Romans used concrete because it was stronger, lighter than stone, and moldable. The invention of concrete was an incredible technological feat. They were conscious of how heavy their building materials were, so they mixed lighter materials like pumice with concrete towards the top of the dome, which helped alleviate the immense weight of the dome. Fun fact, the Pantheon is the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, which basically means that it isn't supported by steel.
To compare the Temple of Minerva and the Parthenon, we'll start out by looking at their architectural features. So with the Parthenon, the Greeks used marble with a limestone base. And on the other hand, the Temple of Minerva used wood, mud brick, and terracotta instead. And these ephemeral materials would eventually lead to the deterioration of the Temple of Minerva. On the other hand, the marble has stood strong against the elements until the Venetians destroyed it in the late 1600s in their war against the Ottomans. In terms of proportions, the Parthenon followed the formula y equals 2x plus 1 to calculate the number of columns per side, while the Temple of Minerva followed a 5:6 ratio, making it a mostly square-like structure. The Parthenon was also built as a peripteral temple, meaning it had freestanding columns all around it. The Temple of Minerva also had freestanding columns, but they were located only at the front and held up a roof. This was known as the portico, which the Parthenon did not have. Additionally, the Temple of Minerva was elevated and had one staircase in front of the temple, while the Parthenon's entire base was a continuous staircase. The Temple of Minerva also featured a triple cella, or 3 rooms for gods. It housed Minerva, or Athena, Tinia, or Zeus, and Uni, or Hera. And in terms of the Parthenon, that only had 1 cella, and that was just for Athena. When it came to style, the Parthenon boasted a strong, sturdy look with the use of Doric columns. The Temple of Minerva drew inspiration from the Doric columns, but modified them slightly, developing the Tuscan columns, which were Doric columns with an added base. The Parthenon also featured an Ionic frieze depicting the Pan-Athenic procession, which consisted of only humans and no gods. However, the Temple of Minerva does not have a frieze, and instead, it uses sculptures of Etruscan versions of Greek gods on the top of the temple to depict mythical events. The most well-known of these events is the battle between Hercules and Apollo over the golden hind, or deer, which was the sacred animal of Apollo's sister, Artemis. Taking a look at the Pantheon, we can see several differences from the previous structures. For one, the Pantheon was made of concrete as compared to the marble and wood, which the Parthenon and Temple of Minerva were made of, respectively. And also, concrete was a new technological advance, which was lighter and stronger than stone, with the addition of being moldable. The Pantheon also didn't rely on columns to support the building, but rather arches which distributed the weight of the structure. Another technological advance is its perfectly circular rotunda, which is shown here, looking sassy because it's perfect.
The purposes of the temples were also varied in that the Parthenon was built not necessarily as a place of worship, but centering on Athena, while the Temple of Minerva was built to worship primarily Athena, but also Zeus and Hera. Meanwhile, the Pantheon was built as a sacred space for all Roman pagan gods. The gods worshipped in the Pantheon were a comprehensive mix from all the regions the Romans conquered, so it included not only gods from Greek mythology, but even some from the Persians and the Egyptians. So the Pantheon was built as a sacred space for the Roman pagan gods, but the gods worshipped there were a comprehensive mix from all the regions the Roman conquered, so it included not only gods from Greek mythology, but even some from the Persians and the Egyptians. However, the Pantheon is also very similar and follows the Temple of Minerva in that it also features a portico. But its columns are of the Corinthian order, since the Romans enjoyed incorporating ostentatious, showy elements, more so than the Greeks at the very least. And here's just a close-up of what a Corinthian column would have looked like. So, in conclusion, by taking a look at these 3 structures, not only do we get a sense of how sacred spaces such as these have changed and progressed over time and through different cultures, we can also trace how each structure derived inspiration from elements of other works and twisted them and changed them to shape their own style of commemorating the deities.